Hey, hello and welcome to this video. It's going to be some tips and tricks that I've been using professionally for quite a while now. So when I'm making things, I'm kind of always looking for ways to improve the workflow. For most part, that is just installing an add-on. So a lot of this video is going to include paid add-ons or add-ons. And the way that I use those add-ons for the most part is just how they're designed to be used. So the tip is really just pinpointing a specific tool in those cases. But at the beginning of this video, I want to do some things that you can do by default in Blender to improve your workflow, because there's some little things here and there that you probably do on a daily basis that you don't actually need to be doing by hand. And then we'll move on to more add-on stuff on the hopefully towards the second half of the video. So yeah, let's have a little look. Some of this is already set up on my computer, so I'll go through it retroactively. So we'll have a look at how I've already got it set up, and I'll explain how it probably is set up on your PC. I tend to use Blender with default settings, so this is going to be for anyone using it on Blender default mode. I use right-click select as well. So yeah, keep all that in mind. If you've changed your settings, it might not be exactly the same. And so here we go. The first one, super easy one, is I really like the way that Blender builds in faces. So when I have deleted all the faces here, I've also got a video that I'll put on the top right card thing, going more in depth into this stuff. I might even cover this exact tip. But Blender is great because you can just hold down F and it'll fill in any faces like this. And you can just keep holding down F and it'll stop at the opposite end there. So that's a really cool thing. That's just how Blender works. Sorry, I can just see that that's too far to that side. So that's cool. That's a good thing to do. But the way that I like to do it, and this isn't going to work perfectly on this shape, but on most complex shapes it works better, is just to select the outer edges here and use, instead of going to Control F and fill, which by default will be Alt F, I assign Alt F to grid fill instead. Now if I just use fill on this, it fills it in like that, which actually can be useful, but that's not how I usually want to fill in something like this. And if I do, I don't know, I'd do it in a different way. I wouldn't be doing it with this fill tool. But if we do use the fill tool, we can also select beauty fill. So there's two ways of doing it. Fill tool there actually works pretty well if I just press Alt J to remove some of those, but it's not, well, it hasn't worked really actually. So I assign Alt F to grid fill instead. So Alt F now instead of pressing grid fill. By the way, if I press Control F, you can just remove shortcuts and change shortcuts by right-clicking. So I'll change the shortcut, I'll press Alt F, and then I've got my shortcut there. So Alt F in this case, the grid fill annoyingly is going to try and guess the span of what you're trying to fill in, which does work most of the time. In an example like this, clearly it doesn't. So let's take the span back down to 1, and then we actually need to change the offset to get this to work. So something like that is similar to what we had before, but what we want is to offset this. And again, there shouldn't be that much cleanup involved usually, but that's a way of filling it in that looks a lot better. It's more designed, and it does speed up the workflow a lot more because it's not just for a scenario like that, which might be easier just to press F as we saw before. But it includes just simply pressing Alt F to fill in a face like this, and that's how the grid fill works. But having it assigned to that specific shortcut is what the useful tool is here. And then keeping it with Alt F in object mode, grid fill doesn't exist, so Alt F is actually a blank shortcut key here. And for me, I actually use it just to go export and right click on FBX and assign the shortcut Alt F. Now I don't do it on that one specifically, I actually do it on the one in the hard ops tools, because the export for Alt F here already has selected objects ticked. I'm not sure how to change that sort of stuff by default. I hope it is possible, probably by just doing this thing up here that I've not seen before, but I'm not that bothered because I've got the hard ops one available to me. I don't know if that's how you do it. I prefer just use the hard ops one. So now I press Alt F, I export it, and I carry on, and I check it out in Engine or whatever, or I have a look at it externally, and then I come back and I edit things. So that's one way of speeding up the workflow. The other ways are, a lot of the time I'll do things like it's easier to be in face select mode, potentially easier to use circle select tools to select things. And then what I like doing, and this isn't going to be set up, is I use Control-Shift-E. So it's not set up at the minute, but what I do is in selection mode we can select, let's see, we want to go to select boundary loop, and we want to, I like to use Control-Shift-E to mark this. So Control-Shift-E, for me that makes sense because it's selecting the edge loop around there. And then also it ties in really well with my hand already being on Control-E for mark seam, because that's usually what I use it for. So when I'm doing this, I'll have a complex object and I'll want a certain selection to be marked as a seam, so I'll do Control-Shift-E and then mark seam. The other part of it is usually I won't even select anything. I could use Shift-G, which is select similar, and I'll select it by normal, or I'll select it by linked flat faces is a good one. And that's not on there by default. So I also use Control-Shift-G to select linked flat faces, because for some reason Shift-G doesn't include linked flat faces, which maybe it's just something they could add. But selection tools, and then go to, see, I don't even know where they are, linked, and then linked flat faces. It's going to select this whole edge here. So if I go to assign shortcut here, Control-Shift-G. So now when I'm marking seams, because I usually want to do it, you can just have seams by sharp edges, or you can have sharp edges by seams. And that's all good, but when I'm actually working through things, they can be more complex than that. And in a lot of cases, I don't necessarily want both. So Control-Shift-G is going to select everything by sharp edges, by linked flat faces, sorry. And then Control-Shift-E is going to select the edge for that. And then Control-E is going to be your edge mode. And then mark seam is how you mark your seam. And on a complex object, that's going to usually unwrap pretty nicely in the unwrap mode. This isn't, but when you go through UVs, that's just something that I use all the time in that exact sort of workflow. So I've got that all set up to custom, and that's pretty much the only ways that I like editing default Blender. The other one is just when in concern with normals, which I have adjusted. So I might actually just open a different version of Blender here for the example. Yep, so as long as I haven't worked on this file, which I probably have. Okay, I haven't, as in this version of Blender. We have face orientation, which by default is going to be red when it's the wrong way around and blue when it's the right way around. And that's pretty good. It makes it super obvious whether you're getting things the right way around or not. But you have to go in and change the face orientation on and off to actually work on the project. I saw this in a tweet, so this isn't something that I came up with, but it's something that someone on Twitter was doing. I can't remember their name, unfortunately. But if I flip this and use it on this file, face orientation, well then it only marks that one as sort of a blue that I want to change actually, but the front facing faces stay the same, which means that I can actually just model this and keep working on it without any distractions, and as soon as I do something wrong, I'm immediately aware of it. I don't have to check it and analyze the model, and it's just a little bit better than just having see-through faces or having that other one on all the time, for sure. So actually changing that, if we go into preferences, we can see the themes, 3D viewport, and then we've got face orientation back, which I do want to change to a slightly darker blue, a different type of blue. That one seems a little bit nicer. And then we've got face orientation front, which I've turned the alpha to 0. I've also adjusted the alpha on this one to be lower, but you could put that to like 0.1, or okay, maybe not 0.1, but something much less that you're going to recognize in the viewport. Not 1, because it's like way too much. 0.4 seems alright, I guess. And in general, just keep it on something that isn't going to, that bright red is hard to look at. This blue color is just a little bit nicer to look at. You can immediately tell when you've done something wrong on the normals, and you don't have to disrupt things and do a check over the model and be like, oh my god, everything's the wrong way around. It just makes everything easier. So actually, that's a lot of tips just with the basic stuff that's in base Blender. I'm also going to go through some stuff as quickly as possible with some other tools. So this is sort of the add-on portion of the video, because there's so many cool things going on. So we can picture this super complex model that I've just made, and we can look at it, and we can go into the mirror modifier and just mirror it by this object, and now I've got some cool stuff going on. Maybe I want to just do some cool things. And I've made whatever I've made. It's super cool. But now I want to go on my final stage of the asset, and I need to convert some of this into a real object for me to sort out the UVs. For most objects, you could probably just apply that mirror and then do some proper unwrapping on this, and that's fine. So I've unwrapped this, and that's okay. I can pack everything later. But in some cases, that's just not going to work because the object now is just a single asset. If I have got a complex model and I want to do some asymmetry on this, modeling this side is going to be okay to separate and then start modeling on. But then the pivot is wrong because the pivot's still in the same location as the other object. So that's not a good solution. Let's try 3D cursor and then mirror this. Well, if I mirror this physically, the seam's in the right place, but as soon as I apply the scale, the orientation pivot point is in the right place, but as soon as I apply the scale, it's flipped because I flipped the object. So my orientation on my faces is wrong. There's a really nice solution to this, and firstly, we don't have to go to mirror and do all that. We can use hard ops. So I'll put some links in the description. Hard ops is a great tool. I don't really use box cutter that much. Hard ops I use all the time. There's so many tools here that just speed up modifiers and so on. But the first one is if I select my object and I select the second object here, and I use Alt-X, which is default to hard ops, then I can just mirror it super easy. Saves me from doing everything that we just looked at. Apart from it is still a mirrored object, and that's fine for the workflow while we develop things. But to separate them, I then use Mesh Machine, which is, again, can be in the description, but Mesh Machine, and there's a tool here called Real Mirror. So when I hit real mirror, all that normal stuff, pivot point correction, and separating the object is done automatically. The mirror here is still on the object, but it's hidden. And now I've got two separate objects. I can make some asymmetry in there. I can UV them separately. If I make a mistake, I can go back to the mirror, turn them back on, and then just real mirror it again to bring it all back. Or even just stash it as an older version of the mesh. You do have to sort of be wary of it creating new folders. That did annoy me because they're called real mirror. There's a setting for that because everything's going to end up in the same folder. It's not called collection real mirror, it's just called real mirror. So let's go to the real mirror tool. Oops. Real mirror. And just say don't create collections. And that's it really. You can do anything else with those little settings down there. And that's it. So that one I absolutely love. Great tool to use in that way. There's also a mirror inside edit mode, which is part of Hardop, which is part of Mesh Machine. You see down here, symmetrize, and that's going to be really useful to actually remove half of the mesh. There's no more having to go in here and just go into wireframe mode and select half the mesh and then delete it. Just going into edit mode and removing half the mesh like that is going to be a super easy way of doing it. And then later on, if you decide that you, well, then in object mode here, just use Alt-X again and mirror it with the Hardops mirror. And then when you actually decide that you like it, you can either apply it or you've edited it more, just turn off remove, and that's just going to create the mirror in the way that you want. So I really love that tool. All of that is really useful and I use it all the time. The other one that I use is, I'll mention the lattice tool in here I use all the time, is because it automatically creates the box and applies it to the whole of the object rather than having to make your own box, scale it to the object, do all that sort of stuff. So that's in Hardops, and so that's really useful. I use that one all the time. When we're talking about UV tools, I use Texel Density Checker. That's a really useful one. So let's assign the checker mask to these. They're a little bit messed up. So let's unwrap this one with a smart UV unwrap. You know, you might want to do it better than that. And then let's go into UV editing mode. Scale this up. Okay, we can see that we're working with two completely different scales. Well, that scaling that I just did, I wouldn't necessarily have to do that because I can be like, right, this is my hero object in the middle here, and I know that I want it to be, even though this is smaller on the side, it's not really a focus of my object. So I want that to be a text density of pixels per meter. The texture that I'm using here is 2K, and I don't want this object to be any more than 256 pixels per meter. So I've put 256, and then I want this one to be double, so I'm going to put it to 512. And now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to fit within the UV space, but working in like that allows me to know that that is half the size. So when I start coming over to pack this, and things are kept within the same sort of ratio, even though the ratio has changed, and we can actually use UV Texel Density Checker here to find out our new Texel Density, so we can see how bad it might be. Say for this object here, calculate the Texel Density. Maybe that's much lower than we want, so we might want to scale it back up. But we can get an accurate breakdown of that sort of stuff. Let's say that this is a refrigerator as well, so the back's facing a wall. It's an immovable object in the game. So we want to maybe just, well, we might just delete those faces, but we know the player isn't going to really see the back of it, so we can then also put that on a much lower Texel density. and then we would still need to repack that, and that's fine. Let's grab both objects and pack them. Oops. Looking at, I think that's a really useful tool, and it just makes your final renders look really good as well, because you can just set everything to a nice texel density, render that image, and then just making sure everything's good. UV Pack Master, that going into here, it's pretty much a standard packing tool, but with every single setting that you could possibly want. I say standard, the method it packs is so much better. I mean, it's better than any other tool out there. But I mean, it's got the settings that you would expect, like fixed scale, fixed rotation, packing with groups, packing with whatever, packing things together. Far too much to go through in just a little tips video like this, but it is an amazing add-on. Same with UV Toolkit, and that's pretty much the last thing that I want to cover, because there's a tool here that I use all the time when looking at trim sheets. I mean, I do have decal machine on here, so if I just press D and then unwrap this to my trim, then I can just do that really quickly, and that's amazing. But we're not talking about that. If I wanted to do this sort of UV unwrap, but with a tool here, UV Toolkit, which I think is paid as well, but there's UV Squares, which is free, then I can unwrap this, and I can just hit straighten UVs after I separate the end here. Straighten UVs, and we've got a nice square UV here. We can rotate 90, and that makes it super easy just to make a trim sheet by hand, if we can't be bothered setting it up through decal machine. But I didn't buy it for that, because that's a free aspect. I mean, there's so many tools here that are really good as well. Like, it's got everything you could imagine for UV tools when it comes to manipulating them. But what I actually use it for is if I select and separate that again, and then I just select the inside edges of this, then this tool has another way of straightening objects called Straighten Island. And it's going to straighten that edge that I had selected, but without warping the shape in a way that is wrong in terms of the straighten UV islands had the ends here as straight, but as we can see, they're not square edges here. So when we actually straighten out like this, yeah, it's a little bit wonky on those corners, but maybe we don't care about that. But if we do, then we can just go straight in with the align tool here, and now it's a lot more accurate than what we had previously when it comes to the shape. This isn't an ideal thing to be applying seams to in this way, so it is going to appear warped, but for the most part that is a method that is really, really useful, and it's something that I use all the time. Alright, I think I've talked enough. I think this video has gone on long enough, so hopefully that was useful, and I'll see you in the next one.